All right, so diving into Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan today, and I know what you're thinking, political philosophy. Not exactly, light beach reading.
Right.
But here's the thing about Hobbes. He was writing during the English Civil War. I mean, talk about a chaotic time.
Oh, yeah.
And his work is all about the struggle between freedom and security, something we're still dealing with centuries later.
That's what makes Leviathan so fascinating. It's not just some abstract theory. It's born out of this real-world experience of watching society crumble and that desperation to find a way to make things stable. Well, you really feel that urgency in his writing.
Exactly. So today we're focusing on part 2 of Commonwealth.
Okay.
This is where Hobbes lays out his solution for how we as humans can actually live together without constantly, tearing each other apart.
And his solution is bold, to say the least. He starts by painting this picture of what he calls the state of nature. Imagine a world with no rules, no laws, just pure self-interest driving every decision.
Oh, wow.
It sounds almost liberating at first, doesn't it?
Maybe for a minute, but then you realize without any kind of structure, everyone's just out for themselves.
Right.
It'd be like the Wild West on steroids, right?
Exactly. Hobbes calls this the war of all against all.
Yeah.
You're constantly on guard, worried about protecting what you never able to really trust anyone. Not exactly a recipe for a thriving society.
So how do we escape this nightmare scenario?
Right.
Enter Hobbes's big idea, the social contract.
It's not a literal contract we sign,
Right.
but rather this unspoken agreement we make to give up some of our individual freedom in exchange for the security that comes with a strong governing power.
So we're trading a little bit of freedom for a lot more safety.
Precisely. And you see this playing out everywhere in our lives, even in seemingly small ways. Think about waiting in line. Sure, it's annoying, but it ensures things move smoothly for everyone, or airport security.
Right.
No one enjoys those long lines.
Yeah.
But we accept those limitations because we value safety and order.
Yeah.
For Hobbes, government itself is founded on this same principle, the social contract.
Okay, so that makes sense, but there's got to be a catch, right?
There is. And it comes in the form of what Hobbes calls absolute sovereignty. This is where things get a bit controversial.
Absolute sovereignty. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. Basically, Hobbes is saying that for this whole social contract thing to work, the power of the government or the sovereign has to be unquestionable, no ifs, ands, or buts.
So kind of like a referee in a game, even if you think they made a bad call, you still have to follow their decision or the whole game falls apart.
That's a good analogy. And remember, Hobbes wasn't promoting some kind of power grab here.
Right.
He'd witnessed the chaos of civil war firsthand, and that experience deeply shaped his thinking. He genuinely believed that any weakness in the sovereign, any division of power would just open the door to more conflict and a return to that terrifying state of nature.
So he wasn't pro-tyranny. He was just really, really afraid of anarchy.
Exactly. For Hobbes, a strong, unified government, even if it meant sacrificing some individual freedoms, was the only way to guarantee peace and stability.
Okay, so absolute power is the foundation. But what kind of government did Hobbes actually picture being built on top of that? Did he have a specific system in mind?
He did. He outlined 3 main forms: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy.
Oh, okay.
And while he doesn't completely dismiss the other 2, he definitely had a favorite.
Let me guess he wasn't exactly a champion of power to the people.
You got it. Hobbes was very much team monarchy. He believed that a single unified will, embodied in a monarch, was just more efficient, less prone to infighting and gridlock.
Interesting. So he valued decisiveness over things like representation or checks and balances, but wouldn't giving so much power to one person, even a king, be a recipe for disaster?
That's a question a lot of people have raised about Hobbes's theory.
Yeah.
And to understand his reasoning, we need to dig a bit deeper into his views on the role of government, and perhaps even more importantly, the very concept of individual rights.
And that is a great place to pause. Now join us for part 2, where we'll explore this complex and fascinating question. Do individuals have any rights at all in Hobbes's world? It's a lot more nuanced than you might think. Welcome back. Last time we left off with this big question. If Hobbes believed in this all-powerful sovereign, did he think regular people had any rights at all? Seems kind of contradictory, right?
It does seem that way, and this is where understanding how Hobbes viewed rights gets really important. You see, we often talk about rights today as being inherent things we're entitled to simply by virtue of being human.
Right.
But Hobbes had a very different perspective.
So it wasn't like a Declaration of Independence situation, with these unalienable rights endowed by our creator.
Not at all. For Hobbes, any freedoms individuals had were essentially granted by the sovereign, not something they inherently possessed.
Huh.
It's a pretty radical departure from how we think about rights today.
Okay, so instead of having rights, we're basically given permissions by the government.
Right.
What did that look like in practice?
Think of it this way. Hobbes believed the sovereign needed to establish clear laws defining what was and wasn't allowed. Anything not explicitly forbidden by those laws was essentially fair game.
So kind of like everything not prohibited is permitted.
Right.
That's a pretty different approach. But what did that mean for someone living in Hobbes's Commonwealth? Could they choose their own job, practice their religion, express their opinions?
In those areas where the sovereign hadn't made specific laws, individuals had a significant degree of freedom. You could choose your profession, practice your religion, even criticize the government, as long as you weren't actively trying to overthrow it.
Yeah.
Hobbes believed people should be free to live their lives as they saw fit within the framework set by the sovereign.
So basically you could have a lot of personal freedom as long as it didn't threaten the overall stability of society. But that also means those freedoms weren't really guaranteed, right? The government could always change the rules if they felt it was necessary.
Exactly. That's a key difference. For Hobbes, security and order always trumped individual liberty. He genuinely believed that a little bit of freedom was a small price to pay for avoiding the chaos and violence of the state of nature.
I can see where he's coming from, especially given the turmoil he lived through.
Right.
But still, it's hard to imagine accepting that the government could just revoke my freedoms if they decided it was for the greater good.
It's a difficult concept to grapple with, no doubt. But I think it's important to remember that Hobbes wasn't advocating for some kind of oppressive totalitarian state.
Right.
He believed a strong sovereign with clearly defined laws was the best way to protect individuals in the long run.
So he wasn't being cynical. He was just trying to prevent the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, look, a little bit of controlled freedom is better than no freedom at all.
That's a good way to put it. And it's worth noting that even in our modern societies, we accept limitations on our freedom all the time, often for the sake of security and order.
That's true. We pay taxes, follow traffic laws, go through security checks. We're constantly making these trade-offs, even if we don't always think about it that way. But there's one area where the tension between individual freedom and state control gets especially complicated, and that's religion.
Ah, yes, the role of faith in the Commonwealth. This is where Hobbes's ideas get really interesting and maybe even a little bit unsettling for modern sensibilities.
Okay, so let's dive into that. Was Hobbes trying to get rid of religion altogether? Was he secretly an atheist trying to undermine the church?
That's a common misconception. Hobbes wasn't necessarily against religion itself. In fact, he recognized its power, the hold it had on people. But what really concerned him was religion's potential to disrupt the peace, to become a source of division and conflict, especially in a society already grappling with the delicate balance between freedom and security.
So how did he propose dealing with this potential powder keg? Did he want to ban religion entirely?
Not quite. His solution was bold, even radical for his time. He argued that the sovereign should have ultimate authority even over religious matters.
Wait, so the king or the parliament would essentially be in charge of religion? That seems like a pretty slippery slope.
It was a controversial proposition, to say the least. But remember, Hobbes was writing in a time when religious wars were a very real and bloody threat. He'd seen firsthand how differences in faith could tear a society apart.
So he was basically saying, look, if we're going to avoid another religious war, someone needs to be in charge, and that someone is the sovereign. But how did he imagine this working in practice? Did he want to create some kind of state-controlled religion with the monarch as the head of the church?
That's an interesting question, and it gets to the heart of Hobbes's views on the relationship between faith and power, a topic that continues to spark debate even today.
And a topic we'll be exploring in more depth when we return for the final part of our deep dive into Hobbes's Leviathan. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we're wrapping up our exploration of Hobbes's Leviathan. And last we left off, we were about to wade into some pretty murky waters.
Yeah.
The role of religion in Hobbes's ideal Commonwealth.
This is where Hobbes really diverges from a lot of modern thinking about the separation of church and state.
Right.
He wasn't advocating for the abolition of religion,
Okay.
but rather for its subordination to the sovereign. In his view, the sovereign had to have the final say even in matters of faith.
So not a ban on religion, but definitely a tight leash. I can see how that would have ruffled some feathers back in his day. But what was his reasoning there? Was it purely about maintaining order, or did he have a deeper agenda when it came to religious matters?
It's a great question, and it goes to the heart of how Hobbes saw the potential for conflict.
Yeah.
Remember, he was writing during a time of intense religious strife.
Yeah.
The English Civil War wasn't just a political power struggle. It was deeply intertwined with religious divisions.
Right. You had Catholics versus Protestants, different Protestant factions vying for control. It was a recipe for chaos.
Exactly. And for Hobbes, the lesson was clear. Allowing competing religious authorities would inevitably lead to instability, potentially even a return to that dreaded state of nature he was so desperate to avoid.
So better a single authority, even if it's a secular one, calling the shots on religious matters than risking all-out religious war. I guess that makes sense from a pragmatic standpoint, but how did he envision this actually working in practice?
He proposed a system where the sovereign would determine the official religion of the Commonwealth, essentially creating a state-sanctioned faith, and would have the power to regulate all forms of religious expression.
So kind of like a state-controlled religion, but with the king or parliament acting as the ultimate authority instead of the pope or some council of bishops.
That's a good way to put it, and this was a radical departure from the way things were done at the time. Remember, the idea of a clear separation between church and state as we understand it today hadn't really taken hold yet. Hobbes was challenging centuries of tradition, arguing that for the sake of peace and stability, the sovereign had to be supreme in both secular and spiritual matters.
I bet that went over like a lead balloon with some folks. It's basically saying, look, you can have your faith, but the government gets to decide what form it takes and how it's expressed publicly.
It was a controversial proposition, to say the least. But in Hobbes's view, it was a necessary measure to prevent religious differences from tearing society apart. And it's important to note that he wasn't arguing for some kind of oppressive theocracy where individual belief was outlawed.
So there was some wiggle room for personal faith. What about freedom of conscience? The right to believe what you want, even if it goes against the official state religion.
Hobbes believed that individuals should have the right to practice their religion privately as long as it didn't conflict with the laws of the sovereign. In essence, you could believe what you wanted in your own heart and mind, but public expressions of faith had to conform to the dictates of the sovereign.
That's a pretty fine line to walk. It seems like there's a lot of potential for conflict there, trying to separate out private belief from public practice.
There is, and it's a tension we still grapple with today, even in societies with strong traditions of religious freedom. Where do we draw the line between individual religious expression and the need to maintain social order and prevent discrimination or violence?
That's a great point. It's like Hobbes is forcing us to confront these really tough questions about power, freedom, and the role of belief in society. Even if his solutions might seem extreme to us today, the core concerns he was wrestling with are still relevant centuries later.
Absolutely. Leviathan might be a product of its time, but the questions it raises about the nature of government, the balance between individual liberty and collective security, and the role of religion in public life continue to resonate today.
So there you have it, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, a bold, controversial, and surprisingly relevant work that challenges us to think deeply about the foundations of society and the complex relationship between freedom and power.
It's a book that stays with you, provokes you to think differently, to question assumptions, and to consider the delicate balancing act involved in creating a just and stable society.
And that's exactly what a good deep dive should do. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual journey. And until next time, keep those minds open and keep exploring the big questions that shape our world.